All right. Well, those in audience, I know I already introduced myself, Landon Derentz, Senior Director of Global Energy Center. Welcome to those joining us online. This is the part of the conversation that I actually enjoy a little bit more. Get me out from behind the podium and into a discussion. And for our start to the summit today, it's a really powerful discussion indeed. I'd like to welcome Admiral James Ellis Jr. for a discussion on the role of energy transformation and redefining defense and national security strategies. Admiral Ellis currently serves as the Annenberg Distinguished Fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. In this role, he oversees the Global Policy and Strategy Initiative, National Security for the 21st Century, and the George P. Shultz Energy Policy Working Group. He retired as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations in 2012 and was elected as a member of the National Academy of Engineers in 2013. Of course, this comes on top of Admiral Ellis's distinguished 39-year career in the Navy, where he graduated from the Naval Academy, the Navy Test Pilot School, Navy Fighter Weapons School. You have many accomplishments here, Admiral, and completed U.S. Navy nuclear power training. I have a tremendous list of accomplishments, but I think it's worth also noting that Admiral Ellis' final assignment was as commander of U.S. Strategic Command, which gives him particular value and resonance in the conversation today. In that position, he was responsible for the global command and control of U.S. strategic space forces, reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense. Admiral Ellis, it's an honor to have you this morning and really look forward to this conversation. At the top of the conversation, I will say I'm going to have a few discussion items here, but the audience and the veterans, both in person and online, you do have a resource to use judiciously. So I don't see many phones out right now, which is a nice change of pace. But askac.org, askac.org if you do have a question. I have a little iPad up here for including you in the conversation as well. Admiral, let's kick off the dialogue. As a former fighter pilot and commander of U.S. Strategic Command, obviously your career has centered on defense and national security. But how did you enter into the energy space overall, and how did your experiences in the military shape your understanding of energy's role in national defense?
Well, thanks, Landon. And first, let me add my congratulations to those of General Jones on your leadership of this initiative for the Atlantic Council. I mean, there's nothing more fundamentally important to the national security of this nation than energy security. And increasingly at Hoover and elsewhere, we conflate the two intentionally. It's not a bolt-on additional consideration. It's central to the conversation about national security. So thanks for doing that. But yeah, like General Jones, I think most of us in the room that have a military background we grew to appreciate the resources and the logistics of energy supply early in our careers. I mean, as you noted, and thanks for not reading the entire CV, it would tell you two things. First, that I'm old, and second, that I can't hold a job, both of which are true. But I did begin as a Navy fighter pilot, and one of the things they teach you at the Fighter Weapons School at Top Gun is you keep one eye on the bogey and you keep the other eye on the fuel gauge, because the F-14 would burn 2,000 pounds a minute in full afterburner and only carried 16,000 pounds. So that's 8 minutes worth of flight, and it doesn't do you any good to shoot down the Su-35 and then run out of gas on the way home and have to give the airplane back to the taxpayers. So anyways, so that began the understanding and the appreciation of it. But as through accidents of selection board malpractice, you get promoted, you begin to understand the criticality of energy to all of your operations. As a nuclear aircraft carrier commanding officer, for example, I refueled the ship every 20 years, which was nice. But unfortunately, I had to be alongside a tanker every 3 days to take jet fuel for the airplanes that flew off that aircraft carrier, which reminded us of the importance of logistics. And as you know, that was followed by Battle Group Command, and then Jim and I were colleagues briefly in Europe, where I ran the southern half of NATO and did a war in Kosovo and those kinds of things. It reminds you of the truths that we've heard for years, the aphorisms that are always out there. Most of us know the one about, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. The one I like is the one from Alexander the Great, who always said, "My logisticians are a humorless lot, for for they know that if my campaign fails, they are the first ones I will slay. And so it brings the importance of logistics home to all of us. And so I grew up in that. And then when I retired from the Navy and moved into the nuclear sector, and then on the board of directors of energy companies that had both nuclear and natural gas, pipeline, LNG export capabilities, oil and coal resources and the like, you understand the complexities of all of this and how it all has to knit together. So again, like everyone else, I'm a product of my life and my environment and the things that I experienced getting to this point. So.
You know, it strikes me though in that career and in the span of time. Obviously, you talked and touched extensively on conventional energy, nuclear energy playing a huge role both in terms of the fleet and your role at Stratcom. But energy is evolving, and the energy space is evolving. There's a energy transition, new technologies. How is that impacting your perspective in terms of the appreciation and association of the evolution of energy in that career to where we are today, and how it's impacting national security?
Well, this again is an important thing to focus on is the balance that we maintain as we work through the energy transition. I don't think there's anyone in the room that argues that the energy transition is not appropriate, but as General Jones noted in his remarks, I mean, there are issues with that. And the way George Shultz used to ask us to think about this at the Hoover Institution was, you know, fairly simplistically, but rather graphically, as a three-legged stool. So if you're thinking about energy policy, there are three legs to that. The first is economic. The costs of it, not just the costs of investment and creation and infrastructure, but who bears those costs in society? Are they fair? Are they borne by those that can least afford it? And how do you incentivize a process that attracts private investment and the like? So we can't subsidize our way out of these energy crises. There isn't enough government money to do that. And we have to create an ecosystem where people can make a fair profit while incentivizing the kinds of behaviors that we need going forward in energy conservation and energy transition. But it's a very complex issue. So the first leg of the stool is the economic piece. The second is the environmental piece. Thoughtful people can't argue about the impact on the environment of our energy policies over decades, and the need to change that and transition that. But again, how does one do that in a balanced way that doesn't trade the reliance on Middle Eastern oil, for example, for reliance on Chinese rare earth processing capabilities and the like, and trade one limitation for another. And then the final piece is national security. So those are the three legs of the stool. And national security is really broader than that because it obviously implies economic security as well. If you don't have a robust economy, you're not going to have national security. So you need to think about it in those three elements going forward. And how do you keep those things in balance? There is no easy answer. Okay, I think it was Ronald Reagan that once said there are simple answers, there are just no easy answers. And so I always get a little nervous when people have declaratory policies that are going to solve everything for us, because in reality it's more complex than that. And that's why conversations like this are so important, because you bring people from industry together, you bring people with military backgrounds and backgrounds, important backgrounds in the environmental world, to understand how we can shape and trade this off in ways that contribute to the national security of the nation writ large.
You know, when I think about that three-legged stool, one feature that is predominant in the conversations here in Washington, D.C. right now is the fact that the United States itself in the last 2 decades has really transformed its energy landscape. And I'm curious your thoughts in terms of what does it mean for the United States to have such an abundance of energy, and how do we need to be thinking about that in the context of its impact both on allies and adversaries?
Well, I think that's the fundamental issue that's changed. I think it was Vladimir Lenin that once said there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. I think Richard Haas kind of modified that and said there were, centuries when nothing happened and decades when centuries happened. And I think the last decade has been one of those from an energy standpoint for the United States. I mean, we've gone, when you think about it, as General Jones again noted, from a culture of privation, a culture of shortage, a culture of long lines at the gas pump, and having to take into account OPEC policies and their impact, to now we have become an energy superpower. I mean, it's absolutely incredible the influence that the nation has and the ability that the nation has. And 8 years ago, I wrote a piece for Secretary Shultz on the need to really create a national energy strategy that's worthy of the name. In other words, that considers how can we do this, not to use as a cudgel to beat up enemies and adversaries, but to use as an enhancement and a tool by which we bring together like-minded nations in a global strategy, a global energy economic commons that acknowledges the differences. This is not about bringing everything, onshoring everything. We can't do that, quite frankly, and global trade is a fundamental underpinning of the prosperity of this nation, and we've got to maintain it. And energy is certainly a way in which we can do that, and we've now seen that with the support that we are able to supply to Europe as it attempts to wean itself from Russian gas. And it's certainly true in the Indo-Pacific if we get into that conversation. So this really has given us an opportunity to move in a different direction, and I would argue that we have not done as well as we might in bringing that together in a cohesive whole with a focus that, again, makes energy not just an ancillary piece of this conversation, but a central piece to the thematics. I mean, there are things that we can do, not just in national security, but for the good of the world. I mean, people forget that more than 20% of the world still doesn't have access to electricity, for heaven's sake. And so we need to think about this in terms of what we can bring to the world and use our energy to benefit mankind, as well as our partners and allies around the world.
So noting that we have clearly a bunch of components that are really healthy and that we need to kind of aggregate, I want to build on your point about the 8 years ago. You have the strategy you're thinking through. We need to have a more cohesive voice on these issues. Do you feel that is being incrementally adopted into the conversation in the national security at the strategic level? I know General Jones was pointing out his example on this was making sure that the Secretary of Energy was at the national security roundtables, right? And I think that there's other avenues for us to have a more vibrant voice on energy policy within these discussions. Curious if you have advice to the veterans here in the audience today about how we can kind of continue to push that forward, or if you feel it's being adequately addressed already.
Well, one of the challenges is, as my grandfather from South Carolina used to say, Jimmy, he always called me Jimmy, he said, it's easy to be a clown if you don't have to run the circus. So I don't want to sit here and criticize what has or has not been done by administrations or individuals. I think we're moving in the right direction, but I'm not satisfied with the pace of that change, Landon, to be perfectly honest. And I think there's an opportunity to do that in a more cohesive and integrated way. And one of the challenges we face, and we don't need to get into the politics of it, but the reality is the continuity that we don't seem to be able to sustain from one administration to the other. And when you sit here in Washington, where many of you sit, and that whooshing sound is the pendulum coming by with an administration change as we go in another direction, and we lack consistency of policy and the like. And you can understand that domestically. It's part of the challenges and the benefits of democracy. But politics used to end at the water's edge. They don't end at the water's edge anymore. I mean, everything has an international dimension to it, and so we need to think about that. And the pace at which we're bringing these elements together, I'm not satisfied with. I think the nation can do better. There is nothing we can't do as a nation if we can resolve those issues and create a consistent vision and policy of America's future and role in the energy sector and writ large in terms of global prosperity and global security.
Well, I know that's some of the inspiration between our conversations, and hope that the Hoover Institute and the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center maybe can put a little bit more motivation behind that progress. You raised our allies. You raised Europe, obviously, in the examples of what's happening in the context of supplementing energy security in that continent, given Russia's ill-advised and unprovoked attack on Ukraine. But you also raised Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific. And so I want to turn really quick to contested theaters. I know and I understand that you've just returned from Taiwan, and many U.S. allies like Japan and Taiwan are heavily dependent on energy imports. So it's not just a feature of a conflict like it is in Russia invading Ukraine, but this is a systemic challenge for those island nations in particular. How does this impact how the U.S. is thinking through logistics and defense planning, and how do we modernize that thinking to keep pace with the transformation of our energy systems?
Well, it's a great point, and at the strategic level, when you think about it from an Indo-Pacific focus, the irony is that both our largest rival and our most important allies both have poor energy security. I mean, China imports 55% of its energy right now, and by 2025 is projected to consume 1/3 of the global energy supply each year. So I mean, they're hugely reliant on that. And you know, Xi Jinping's predecessor, Hu Jintao, talked about his Malacca problem. How do you get that resource through the Straits of Malacca? And as a result, now Xi Jinping is trying to set up pipelines to the east, to the Caucasus and Central Asia, to eliminate or at least mitigate that reliance on maritime trade, so that the first island chain doesn't become a containment barrier should there be a conflict and crisis. But our allies in the region are even more dependent on energy. Taiwan, and you're right, I just returned from there, and we had a lot of conversations with the president and his national security team about the criticality of their energy situation. They import 98% of their energy. They have a 12-day supply of natural gas, about a 30-day supply of oil, and about a 45 to 50-day supply of coal. 300 oil tankers and 100 LNG tankers call on Taiwan every year to keep their energy going. And yet they have aspirations to increase their participation in the new AI technologies, which is going to continue to drive up their energy consumption. And so how they deal with that going forward, and at the same time they're shutting down their nuclear plants. There's only one remaining. They shut down the next to last one this spring. They'll shut down the final one next year is their plan. So, and they have a net zero goal in 2050. So how do these trends all mitigate? Where's the Boolean overlap in all of that, where there's a sweet spot that they can do all of that and still meet their energy goals? And there are real challenges associated with that. Japan is increasingly, or is hugely reliant on energy imports, as you know. Even more so after the Fukushima tragedy, though they are restarting their nuclear reactors slowly and deliberately, as well they should. They import 90% of their energy. South Korea has similar challenges. So the irony is we find both our potential adversaries and our allies have energy independence, and at the strategic level, we need to think about how this can all work. Right. And we can perhaps talk at some point, if we want to, about the tactical and operational challenges that we would face in the theater. But there are huge opportunities to build relationships with other countries with whom we don't have as robust an interaction. Indonesia, for example, and others. How do we ensure the security of the Indian Ocean and bring Indian partners into that as we look at logistics supply chains that might have to come out of around the tip of India and Sri Lanka and Ceylon through the Bab el Mandeb and the like. So lots of issues to deal with here.
You know, Admiral Ellis, I think I do want to turn in a second to the more pragmatic operational logistics aspects. But before I do that, you raised something I think is really interesting regarding Taiwan's net zero goals. And it raises a conversation here that I'm seeing from a question from the audience. Thank you, Kevin, for bringing this to our attention. Net zero goals also highlight a growing confluence of energy and climate policy. Right. My career is much shorter, but in my time in the U.S. government, at the Department of Energy, State Department, in the White House, I watched energy and climate verticals become parallel institutions into a really singular program of thought leadership. But I don't know that is matched externally, right? There are still very strong environmental groups. There's the energy industry. And I feel that politics, as you noted, used to end at the water's edge. How do we bridge the environmental movement into these conversations, and what's their role in enhancing and impacting energy policy and progress? How can we engage to make sure that we're thinking through the security and defense applications, but also really being thoughtful about very real trajectories towards net zero that the vast majority of the global economy is pursuing at this point?
Well, you raised the fundamental point of how do you integrate a national approach, and how do you have meaningful conversations that, as General Jones mentioned, lead to action and outcomes, not just conversations. But I do think we need to find an ability and a venue to have conversations, and your efforts here certainly can contribute to that, and hopefully ours at the Hoover Institution can as well, where you bring those people on board and make them part of the conversation. Again, quoting George Shultz, he said, if you want people aboard at the landing, you need to have them aboard at the takeoff. And so if you're going to shape policies and you're going to make demands and you're going to decide what will be done and what won't be done, where the allocation of the national treasure is going to go and what that prioritization looks like, and how you're going to adjust the rheostats to fairly and equitably deal with all of these three legs of the three-legged stool, then you've got to have a venue for having that conversation. I would argue that we have not had that consistently in the past, and we need to enable that. And that, too, is one that can be subject to the vagaries of politics, and we need to get beyond that. We need to have credible institutions like the Atlantic Council that can convene those kinds of people in a not for attribution way that allows candid conversations. And I think when you can do that, when people roll up their sleeves and are put in that room and say, hey, we need solutions out of this, not policy and pundits and punditry, but real solutions, you'd be amazed what you can get. And you can have help in making priorities, and not saying we're never going to do that, but we're not going to do that now. We can't do that now. And increasingly, as I was talking with some of our colleagues here at the conference, we're a very rich and powerful nation. We can afford some of these things. I mean, you and I can afford to pay a premium for green energy and our utility bills and the like. There are a lot of folks who are living paycheck to paycheck that don't have that capability. We need to understand what the implications of these things are more broadly. But the important thing is to bring people into the conversation. And I think when you do that, thoughtful people are beginning to understand the limitations. I mean, you've seen that in a subtle shift in the environmental community's views on nuclear. I mean, there's a reality that if you care about the climate, you care about global warming in the near term, you're not going to be able to get there with a wholesale doing away with nuclear power. It just simply isn't going to happen. And one can make a compelling case, and many independent analysts have, that you're going to have that as part of the equation, at least for the near term. Maybe not forever, but until the maturation of grid scale, season-long storage technology for renewable energy, the kinds of things that we know about, because every one of these things has second and third order implications. I mean, you talk about grid scale storage, and when I talked to the German ambassador after they made their decision about shutting down their nuclear plants, I said, how are you going to store your renewable energy? First off, he told me they weren't going to increase their reliance on Russian oil, which didn't prove to be possible. And he said, well, we're going to do pumped storage. And I said, pumped storage? How are you going to do that? Do you have the topography for that? He says, no, we don't, but we're going to use Switzerland. And I thought to myself, you guys got into trouble in 1939. Have you told the Swiss that you're going to do this? But I mean, the point is there are these trade-offs and these things that have to be balanced. And I'm not joking about it or trivializing it. I'm just saying there has to be a level of conversation that understands the criticality of this, no nuclear pun intended, and the need for action. And I think that's what we need to get on with, and then translate that into viable policies that have a consistent application from one administration to another.
I think your point about the nuclear industry and the enthusiasm around that's actually really interesting in this conversation, because it points out, and something I've seen more the longer I've done this, the climate conversations, energy security, these aren't monolithic communities, right? There's a growing body of work to think through. How do we what are the solution sets? And as you get more familiar with how complex the energy system is, I think both the environmental movement and the energy sector are adapting to have a diversified set of responses. I do want to, you talked about the operational challenges, and so I do want to go back to our conversation on the Indo-Pacific, where fuel logistics are particularly quite constrained. And then I want to build this into maybe a future-looking aspect. At the Global Energy Center, we're really keen on making sure that we understand the vulnerabilities of the system that is existing and how that impacts geopolitics. You talked about the Straits of Malacca. Also want to be thinking about how that transforms over a horizon. But let's start with where we're at today. What are the major vulnerabilities you see currently in fuel supply chains for U.S. forces? What needs to be done to ensure reliable fuel availability? These are issues, and we can broaden this out to a larger thought about not just Indo-Pacific, but obviously fuel security continues to be a predominant feature of national defense. And how are you thinking about that in the context today?
Well, I'll look at it from a maritime perspective, but there are others from other branches of service in the room that fully appreciate that. It's just as true in the Army and the Marine Corps and the Air Force as it is in the Navy. So in no way am I diminishing or trivializing the logistics challenges for anybody that's fighting or dealing with a crisis in an AOR that covers 100 million square miles of ocean. So, but the fact of the matter is, we haven't thought about contested logistics for decades in the military in a way, and it's now been brought home in the Ukrainian situation to some degree. We've not faced it, but the Ukrainians certainly have, and through our crises in the Gulf and even the minor dust-up that I was a part of in Europe and in Kosovo and the like, and the Afghan campaign, we've been able to build secure facilities from which we operate, and we bring in Pizza Huts and things like that, and we deal with the logistics vulnerabilities that come with the vulnerability of fuel convoys to IEDs and the things that are significant and have proven to be significant. But we managed to get our way through that. That's going to be a much different situation in a maritime-focused conflict in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, the unclassified analyses that I've seen say that for a confrontation, even not a conflict in the Western Pacific, the Navy's going to need 100 tankers, for example. Right now, through our agreements and the like, we have access to fewer than 10. And so, how do you deal with the realities of that? I think is something that we have to wrestle with. And it's broader than that. Many of the critical parts to supply our ships on deployment arrive in regional supports by FedEx and then get transferred out to the ships by helicopter or carrier onboard delivery aircraft, or ships come into port, replenishment ships, and take them out. You have to ask yourself, in a contested logistics environment, is that supply chain going to be there going forward? And you can make an argument that it may not be. And even if it exists, are your allies and partners going to be willing to give you access as they get coerced by a dominant China, for example, in the region? Just to use that as a hypothetical. And so those kinds of things are hugely important. How do you rearm and resupply ships is important. Do you have enough logistics ships to come alongside and the like? You can't reload currently VLS canisters, the vertical launch canisters on Navy ships at sea. And so if you're off Taiwan and you need to rearm, where are you going to go? If you've got maybe Japan as the closest one, but Guam is a long way away. Many days transit and the like, and so the whole context of this needs to be rethought with a focus on logistics broadly, but energy specifically. And one of my colleagues at Stanford has done an analysis, and within 500 air miles, unrefueled air miles of Taiwan, China has 35 airfields. We have 2, and both of them are in Japan. And so, the question then becomes, how does logistics work in this? And we need to begin to think through that and take action to deal with those realities. And I'm not implying that it's not being done or being addressed. I'm just implying that, hey, I don't know what timeline you believe we're on for this. I hope we're on a deterrent timeline where the conflict and confrontation never happens. But a big part of that, as we know, deterrence is defined as capability and will. We may have the will, but we need the capability. Otherwise, you get into the old line that they fed Maverick in the first Top Gun. Maverick, your mouth is writing checks your body can't cash, and we need to make sure that we've got those capabilities in hand.
Well, you mentioned one capability would be increasing, for example, the tanker fleet. So like a very literal aspect of the ships and the infrastructure of the fleet itself. In the context of the Veterans Advanced Energy Summit, I'd also like to bring in the role of alternative energy technologies, because we can eliminate some of the fuel use in different ways as well. So how can the U.S. military mitigate these risks through alternative energy technologies, whether that be renewable energy, electrification, nuclear, and how can that play a role in overcoming some of these fuel supply challenges?
Well, you've got a lot of talent here at the Atlantic Council. Denny McGinn was sitting in the front row over here, and he's done a lot of work in that, and was a part of some of our efforts early on, about 8 years ago at Hoover, as we looked at what George Shultz used to call the energy transformation or game-changing technologies for the military, and certainly they're out there. We talked about the reliance on fuel, but we also now have a situation where your marine company is pumping hundreds of pounds of batteries to make night vision goggles and radios work and the like. And so first we need to, obviously there needs to be an energy efficiency component to this, and that can be with some of our battery technologies, the rapid recharging capabilities, the multiple ways in which you can do that, even if it's raining and you can't use a solar panel. What else can you use to recharge the batteries, and much more quickly, and how do you increase the energy density and not the weight and the like? So there's an efficiency piece to that, and the efficiency goes to ship size stuff. I mean, they've done explorations or investigations of putting flaps on ships that reduce on the stern, that reduce the drag and therefore reduce the fuel consumption. And so we need to think about how we do things more efficiently with better performing jet engines and the like. Can we reduce the cost and increase the availability of synthetic fuels that draw on capabilities that don't have environmental impact? So there's lots of dimensions to this. There isn't anything that's being pursued in the technical sector now that does not have a national security implication. Whether it's small modular reactors to power remote basing options, so that you don't have to truck in that fuel oil that I spoke of earlier. There's lots of elements to it, and great opportunities. When I talk to veterans, and we have a number of them in the Bay Area that are associated with the business school and Stanford and the like, or exploring other opportunities that they leave the service. There's lots of startups that are heavily engaged in this exploitation and enhancement of these new technologies. Whether it's all the way down to the high-tech end of the role of graphite supply chains in battery anodes and those kinds of things, to the broader, as I say, small modular reactor kind of things. There's lots of opportunities here. All of those things are going to be translatable into a national security element. But again, at what cost? I mean, here again, it's another one of those trade-offs you have to make. At the end of the day, combat effectiveness is what you have to have. That's why you have a military, and so you can't diminish that. But I would argue, and I think Denny and others have powerfully, that you can have both in this case if the technology continues to mature, and we need to keep that being integrated into our military, and the veterans are going to be a huge part of that. They bring an awareness of technology, they bring a sensitivity to the need, and they bring a passion to its solution that startups across the country are snapping up those kinds of talent, that kind of talent, if you want to be a part of this.
I do want to come back to the talent pool and what veterans can really offer to some of these conversations. But thematically, I think our conversations inspired quite a few data points on nuclear in particular. And I just want to build on some of your roots here and your career. As I look through the feed of questions, there's aspects of financing nuclear, about the role of policy and legislation in helping enable nuclear. There's also conversations in terms of tackling some of the harder issues in spent fuel and how we leverage the full nuclear life cycle for impact in this space. Can I just get your reflections on those comments?
Yeah, no, all of those are legitimate, and indeed they color the conversation wherever you have it. I mean, I heard had a lot of these conversations in Taiwan 2 weeks ago with the president and his national security advisor, who, the DPP, the elected party from the president, which the president of Taiwan is a part of, had a plank in their platform against nuclear energy and have been leading the shutdown. And they too are concerned about, what do we do with the spent fuel? And as the nuclear physicists in the room will know, there are some, aren't there? No, I'm sure there are. Anyway, when you have spent fuel, even though it's no longer usable in a nuclear reactor, 98% of the energy is still in it. Okay, if you can reprocess it, as the French do, and the Russians and the Japanese and others, you can get that energy back. It's not a perpetual motion machine, but it's close. If you can get 98% of the energy back. Now you still have to deal with the actinides, the heat, and the radioactivity of that, and long-term storage, and will continue to be a challenge. But we have to have a broader understanding, and I'm not trivializing this at all. The nuclear piece has to be considered, but we also put over 200 million metric tons of stuff into the atmosphere every year in this country, burning fossil fuels to create electricity, and that too is a waste issue. And so, how do you deal with the carbon dioxide and you know, is sequestration a part of that? I mean, so there's each of the energy chains has its own challenges. Even renewables, we know about the problems with hydro, for example, and its impact on ecological systems and the like. You know, solar panels cover huge amounts of acreage, 50 square miles, to give you the equivalent output of a single nuclear plant that occupies 1 square mile, and that has environmental impact. Not to mention the rare earths that and materials that have to go into it that have their own carbon footprint. So, you know, if we can come up with a model that everyone can agree to, the interesting piece in the energy sector, as you would know, is that every area of interest has its own models. If you're a renewables person, you've got your own model. Solar, if you're a wind person, you've got your model that shows that you can do it all. Nuclear is the same way. Where's the model that fairly puts everything into the mix and allows us to dial the rheostats in what my wife, the engineer, would tell me is an optimization problem, to get this balance right so that we can optimize it and then adjust as things evolve and the technologies deliver? I think those are the kinds of conversations, getting back to my earlier point, that we need to have. But on the nuclear side, again, I didn't run an advocacy agency for nuclear, but obviously I believe in its capabilities when well and safely done. I think the waste issue is a political problem, much more so than it is a technical problem. In other words, we have now capabilities for dry cask storage that we're using in a commercial nuclear industry in this country that can serve us for another 100 years. And I think, you know, technology being what it is, I think we can figure this out. Reprocessing is an option. It's expensive. But if we value that and want to price that in, and the government wants to get into that, we made a choice not to do that, again, because of the economics. It's much more expensive to reprocess spent fuel than it is simply to buy new uranium and use new fuel. And so from an economic standpoint, a utility that's based on shareholder interest and making money isn't going to fund a reprocessing facility. That's a potential role for the government. We've chosen not to do that in this country, but other countries have done that quite comfortably. So there are solutions. President Obama did a blue ribbon panel some years ago on this, and they produced it was a bipartisan effort. Actually, it was a nonpartisan effort, which is even better. And they produced a blueprint for dealing with nuclear spent fuel, which included the creation of a TVA-like agency and consensus storage in regions in the United States. And we've not done as much in implementing those recommendations as we might. So I think we know what the answers are, at least as the technology exists now. We just have not made a lot of progress, nonpartisan progress in advancing them.
Well, I find the idea of a balanced proposal intriguing, and I think that probably does need to emanate from a nonpartisan community thinking through those issues. It also is a reflection on the diversity of energy resources. And I was in Europe for the Partnership on Transatlantic Energy and Climate Cooperation, led by the Department of Energy a few months back in Bucharest. The Romanians hosted it. And a feature that was very expansive in some of the dialogue with the Europeans was this focus on indigenous resources. And obviously, we talked about how some are deficient on that. But as we go through the makeup of an energy system that is kind of all of the above, and balanced, it's important to reflect on the fact that each of our allies has a different set of how they're prioritizing and going back to those models, because they're probably based on a different outlook on energy security. How do we tie those together, you know, at a moment when we're talking about overcoming supply chains and influence from the Chinese and future adversaries in a much more complex energy system? How do we bridge the gap of such a diverse energy makeup between our allies and partners and turn some of these vulnerabilities into strategic opportunities as well?
Wow. Well, as the poet famously said, man's reach must exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? In other words, these are aspirational goals, and those kinds of conversations I think they're more readily available now. I think there's more of a sensitivity to where we are and literally the inflection point at which we find ourselves in terms of global energy. For a while, we were perhaps too optimistic that we could have it all you know, that this was the 80s coming back, you can have it all, and we're finding we can't, that there are difficult trade-offs that have to be made, and some of them involve, you know, national economies and national interests and the like. And so, again, the important part is to begin that conversation. There can be, I think, opportunities. You know, the supranational organizations have kind of fallen in repute over in recent years, and there's a lot of criticism about everything from the, you know, the World Bank to the UN to the, you know, the World Health Organization these days. But I do think there's an opportunity to think collectively about that, and that gets us back to the energy conversation with which we began, Landon, and is how do we bring like-minded allies and partners into a conversation in which energy is no longer a peripheral issue, it's a central issue. And I think bringing in the enlightened self-interest that you talk about, I think that's fair. I mean, you have to bring that into the conversation. But there are also, you know, realities that have to be brought to bear as well. We can't do it the way we've always done it. And we're finding that as nations, unfortunately, are finding they have to back away a bit from their global zero commitments because they realize that using current technologies and the economic pressures and national security pressures they're under, that they're not executable at quite the same timeline they had hoped. And so I think George Shultz used to call that getting mugged by reality. And so I think there's a lot of that going around. I think that makes us more open to these conversations and more important that they begin now. But ultimately, we're going to have to craft relationships and partnerships that can find that win-win-win situation. You may not get everything you want or you need in terms of enlightened self-interest, but you get a significant share. And as long as the perception is that process is equitable, that it's fair, that their interests were considered moving forward, I think we may have an opportunity. But it's not going to be an easy journey, which is even more reason to get started.
Well, I have two final questions here, and one I promise will be at least a softball. No, you know, we've spent a lot of time talking about the global complex energy system. Yeah. I've been very seized personally by the modern warfare that we're seeing in the context of Israel and Lebanon, the pagers that went off, and having the ability to cause that kind of chaos in a country. I have to imagine that can be deployed to other technologies as well. Yeah. And so, do you feel confident that strategic defense officials and national security experts are adequately thinking about that in the context of our domestic energy system as well?
Yeah, I think I do, and Jim can talk to this certainly better than I. But you know, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, has critical infrastructure projects. They're very much aware and sensitive to this. There have been a few reports in the press about intervention into SCADA systems, you know, the automated controls for electric grids, and even in some cases small hydroelectric plants and the like. And so there are vulnerabilities there that are the next step for your classic cyber attack, not just denial of service, but have the ability to turn things off. I mean, in a previous life, in a classified domain, I at Stratcom worked, cyber capabilities and the like, and they can be hugely impactful, but as we've seen from Ukraine, they can be mitigated as well. And it's important that you bring resilience in this, because you can't build your firewalls high enough or thick enough to keep the adversaries out, particularly if that adversary happens to be an insider threat. And so there's lots of ways to look at this thing, and I do think there's an awareness of that. Some of our colleagues years ago worked on that, on the chemical bio end of that too, as we look at CRISPR and the ability to craft, pandemics, tailor-made pandemics for the future. There's lots of scary scenarios out there, and I do believe that our national security elements are very much aware of that. But that is being democratized. That's now you can do gene splicing technology in your kitchen with something you order over Amazon, and so the availability of that, I think, is the biggest concern now, and it no longer has to be a powerful state actor that drives these kinds of things. You can have disaffected folks, either internal to your society or external to your society, that decide they want to send a powerful signal and do so. So our vigilance has to be there. It has to continue and be ratcheted up appropriately. But we can't live in and a fortress mentality. I mean, part of the greatness of democracies is the freedoms that we enjoy, and so we rely on our national security element to do that. But it does highlight the point you're making, that those of us in the energy sector, and I, perhaps too arrogantly consider myself still to be a part of that, even though I'm not on the boards and oversight roles, we have an obligation to consider that as well. And because it's that ensures our security. I mean, this is not something that's inconvenient. Yeah, it'll bug you if you can't get the news or you can't recharge your cell phone. But when these things could happen and reduce your access to satellite communications, cut off electricity that's keeping ventilators and premature baby incubators at hospitals running, and when these kinds of things have societal effects, you have to think about it in those terms and decide how you're going to mitigate this going forward, and we can do that. Early in the Ukrainian war, I had a conversation with some folks at the, believe it or not, the Kyiv School of Economics, who were running their university from a basement as the Russian attack was underway. And I talked with a young woman who was in charge of their cybersecurity, and her advice to me was, Admiral, she said, don't talk about robustness, talk about resilience, because they're going to find a way to get at you, and you just have to have an alternate path in order to ensure that you still have access to these critical elements. And most critical of those, of course, is our energy supply.
Admiral Ellis, we covered a lot of ground today. I know I said I was going to have an easy one, but I think we'll end it there. Really appreciate the conversation and you making the time to join us for the Veterans Advanced Energy Summit this year.
Delighted to have a small role in it all. Thank you very much.